folks. My name is Mo Amir, and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show right here on Check and Check Plus. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Tonight, is comedy under attack? After high-profile on-stage physical attacks on comedians like Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, can people still take a joke even if it's in poor tastes? Or do comedians have an inherent responsibility to not punch down? You've seen her on The Late Late Show with James Corden. Juno Award-winning comedian Sophie Buttle will give us her take. But first, let's talk about systemic racism in British Columbia. What is systemic racism, and what does the BC government hope to do about it? Our first guest tonight is the BC NDP MLA for Surrey Green Timbers, as first elected in 2017. By trade, she was a drug and alcohol counselor and support worker for women facing domestic violence. She is BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives, as appointed in 2020. She is Rachna Singh. Rachna, so nice to see you.
So good to see you, brother.
I'm a big fan, so I'm very excited about this.
I think it's a mutual. I'm a big fan of yours, and I could not wait to be on your show. So thanks for having me.
You're very kind. We have a big topic to talk about, systemic racism. I feel like this word gets bandied about quite a lot, including by politicians, but I feel like there's still a good segment of the population that doesn't actually know what it means. So how would you define systemic racism?
So, Mo, we live in a colonial society. We talk about racism like this. I think if we talk about Canada, we talk about British Columbia, established on the colonial structures. And those structures are very deeply embedded, even in our systems, when we talk about even the government systems. And those are some policies that have been put into place that are keeping people behind. Those are Indigenous, Black, marginalized populations. And policies that can be consciously done, some are unconsciously done. But they are so deeply embedded in the system that they are not working for one segment of the population. In some cases, it can be Indigenous, Black, or the racialized people like us. But these are the policies, and that's what when we talk about systemic racism, sometimes to identify it can be very difficult, very challenging, but also to work on it is extremely important, because that's how, if we start tackling the systemic racism, we are able to bring people up.
Right. And one of the challenges I've had when I talk about systemic racism or institutions that exhibit systemic racism is that people then say, oh, is everyone in that institution or organization racist? And I kind of push back and I say, no, it's not that everyone is racist. It's rather that that institution manifests certain unconscious biases where clearly racialized people have different outcomes and often negative outcomes compared to other folks. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a fair assessment, but then also I think a lot of people get very defensive when you say, are you racist? And people would say, no, I'm not racist, right? And nobody wants to be labeled as a racist. But what are you doing to breaking those barriers? To be anti-racist. Even if we look at an institution, I won't say that everybody in an institution is racist, but what about the policies that have been in place? What have you done to eradicate those policies when you know that some policies are leaving people behind, that they are causing barriers for people to access the services? And that's what I think the anti-racist, like you have to take some further steps.
What are some examples that we've seen in BC? I mean, I'm thinking of the Indigenous girl and her grandfather that were arrested at the BMO bank because they were using a status card as identification. And clearly that was very aggressive in terms of the response. Are there other examples that we've seen that we look at and we go, yeah, there's clearly a systemically racist policy or outcomes that are being experienced?
No, we have seen like that example that you have given, that just breaks my heart. And I think anybody who has heard about it, just your blood boils, right, to hear about it. But that even in the hospital settings, we just had a report called Plain Sight that talk about the Indigenous experience. But we know that so many times racialized people go and try to access services, whether it is at the hospital setting or in the education institution. There are some barriers that these communities face, sometimes they are able to spell it out. They come out as a news item. But a lot of times people are not even able to spell it out, even to recognize that. But how come that some certain people don't have access to housing? And a lot of times you see that are the marginalized populations, racialized populations.
Right.
What is happening there? Like what we need to do, what kind of policies we need to bring in that those people have equal access to housing or equal access to wealth. If I talk about the Black population, if you look at the stats, which we don't have the consistent stats, and we will get more into detail about it, but how come they are not able to accumulate the wealth like many other communities are able to do? Right? So those are the systemic issues that communities are facing, and we need to recognize them.
So let's get into this piece of legislation that you spearheaded, the Anti-Racism Data Act. What exactly is it? It sounds like you're collecting data. How does this work? Is it just government institutions? What's the plan here?
So it is what the communities have been asking us. They have been telling us that there is racism. And also the government institutions, which we have talked about, government services also, are not immune of that racism. But to measure that racism, you need to have some stats, which we never did. We were doing the patchwork, we were collecting some kind of data or reports, but not in a consistent way. So this was the demand from the community partners that collect this data, because if you don't have in front of you, how can you start working on the policy work that needs to go into it? So that is, but also at the same time, what we were hearing was, historically, when this data was collected or these stats were collected, they further marginalized those communities. They further put them in a bad light rather than benefiting them. So how to collect this data so that it is no community harm happens? That's why a lot of effort, a lot of time we took in developing this legislation, co-developing with our Indigenous and Métis partners, and also consulting with the large segment of the population that is going to be impacted by this data.
And so is it looking at healthcare, policing? What are the institutions that are
Those are the institutions that we have heard about. We know about the policing, that how certain representation of certain communities, over-representation of certain communities in the when they are stopped by a policeman or they are incarcerated, or even in our justice system. We have heard about those stories, but we don't have the clear data about that. So those are the key sectors that have come up. Policing has, healthcare has, housing I've talked about. Education has come over and over again. Education institutions, K-12 institution, as well as the post-secondary education. So these are the key sectors, but we want to really know from the communities themselves. That's why I think it is up to the communities to tell us which are the key sectors within the government they would really like us to focus on.
Well, I think this is an incredibly ambitious and in some ways very historic project because, again, like I said at the top, I think politicians talk about systemic racism, but it's very rare that we see the action. And this sounds like it's laying the foundation to actually create the proper action to fill in those gaps and to solve the systemic racism in our society. So my next question is, I know that the data collection will start and we're expecting a report in June 2023. Is it just a summary of statistics? Will there be recommendations? And sort of what assurances do British Columbians have that what's collected in terms of data will actually be acted upon?
We are not collecting data for the sake of data, because that's what communities have said.
Isn't that what government does?
Yeah, because that's why it was to build that trust, right? To get to where we are today, when we introduced the legislation, we had to put in the groundwork. As you said, a lot of times assurances have been given, promises have been made, but now no action has been taken. But we, as what makes me so proud is that we are going to take the action as well. Introduction of the legislation is the first step. And now with the collection of the data and the report, the public report, and then the implementation on that, the policy work that needs to go. And one thing that I always say, Mo, that make us accountable when those public reports come out, make the government accountable that what is the government going to do with this report? Like what kind of actions or what kind of steps the government has taken. Within the legislation also, we have made the requirement that there would be a data legislation committee that will keep checks and balances on the government, like how this, first of all, how this data will be collected, and once the data is collected, what kind of policy work that will be going into it.
Well, you know, this is a topic that's very important to me. So if I see recommendations that are not being acted upon, I'm sure you're going to hear it from me.
Please do. Please do. And that's what I always say, that we as government, and I am part of the government, that we have moral and ethical responsibility to tackle racism. And not just by words, but also with actions.
Absolutely.
And that's why I'm so proud to be in this role that Premier Horgan has given me as the first ever Parliamentary Secretary of British Columbia.
I love it. Rachna, this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, brother.
Folks, that was BC's Parliamentary Secretary for Anti-Racism Initiatives and the BC NDP MLA for Surrey Green Timbers, Rachna Singh. Now, after some business, is comedy under attack? We've all seen the slap heard around the world, but how do comedians feel about it? Do comedians, as performers, shoulder a social responsibility to the culture, or is the comedy show truly the last acceptable protected space for free speech in society? Juno Award-winning comedian Sophie Buttle is up next. I'm Mo Amir. This is VANCOLOUR.